And we find here tonight, as we're winding down our study of Paul's first letter to Timothy and the church that he was looking after in Ephesus, as I said before, a real mixed bag of themes. There's several different themes being taken on, and at certain points in the text, a real change of subject. And so this would be a good time for me to remind you that you're all invited to a question period after the service. If you'd like to stay for 5 or 10 minutes, there'll be some verses that I'm hardly touching on at all tonight due to the nature of the text. And so maybe we can talk about those, if you'd like, in the question period. I'd like to begin tonight by giving you an outline of the text. The Bible study groups tried this for themselves, and here's mine just for interest's sake. I hope you'll find it interesting. I see the text broken down into 3 parts tonight, and verses 17 to 25 of chapter 5 all has to do, I think, with appropriate treatment of elders. You could argue that. You could say the later verses in this text, in this section, aren't talking specifically about elders, but I think they are. I think verses 17 and 18 speak about giving double honor to those elders who deserve it, and verses 19 to 21 talk about giving dishonor to those who deserve it, those who, through the witness of 2 or 3 witnesses, prove to be poor leaders. And then verses 22 to 25, I think, are instructions on how to prevent the need for dishonoring elders who've stumbled into sin. But all of those fit together under this one title of appropriate treatment of elders. At chapter 6, verse 1, I remind you again that Paul was not writing in verses and chapters. They were added later for clarity. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6 speak about quite a different subject, and that is appropriate treatment of masters. He means by the slaves who are owned by them. The problem arose in the church. There were Christians who happened to be slaves. What do you do for a living, you would say at Care Group? Well, I'm a slave. My master just let me out for the night. And this is a problem. It involves some problems. Sometimes the slaves had believers for their masters, and there was some question of whether or not the slave should continue serving his master. Paul says yes, he should. And so it talks about the appropriate treatment of masters by the slaves who are owned by them. Then we go on to verses 3 to 5, and there find appropriate treatment of false teachers. It doesn't say they were teachers particularly, but some of them no doubt were. And he talks about these people and how to avoid them. He talks about the sort of things that they represent that should be avoided. And as he goes through this text, or as he goes through the description of these men of depraved mind who are deprived of the truth, he ends with one particular example of their deprived thinking. And that is that godliness is a means of great gain. That's an interesting thing for us in this part of the world and in this century, when there are many men who are making a tremendous amount of money through their pursuit of godliness. And so it's interesting to see that classified under this heading. But because he brings up the subject, then the next few verses, the next 5 verses, verse 6 to 10, talk about the appropriate treatment of this false teaching and how we should handle this idea that godliness is a means of making a whole lot of money. So that's the outline, and it's certainly not definitive. You could argue about it all the way along the line, but I thought that I would show you that to show you how I'm handling the text tonight. What I want to major on is this section here, the appropriate treatment of this false teaching, because it's very prevalent, and because I think in a different way these other 3 sections are very straightforward and don't deserve or don't warrant the same amount of attention. They're straightforward, we understand them, we grasp them, we put them into practice, and that's that. In verses 6 to 10, then, we find a discussion of this issue, the benefits of godliness. That's what Paul is talking about here, the true benefits of godliness versus the benefits ascribed by these men who are deprived and depraved in the thinking. So once again, the subject, the benefits of godliness, we find Paul speaking of the same thing he's talked about all the way along the line. And I'd like to show you that. I've been trying to show you that week by week. That Paul hasn't had a whole scattered mind full of ideas. He's really had one objective for the church in Ephesus all along. We saw it mentioned very clearly in chapter 2, verse 2, and he's talking about it again. In chapter 2, verse 2, he's talked about our objective of leading a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. And he's been talking about godliness and sometimes dignity and how to attain those all the way through. So now he's talking about the benefits of godliness and specific reference to material gain. And so we follow him along as we find him teaching this. His main point comes from verse 6, the first verse in this little section. The main point is that there is great gain in godliness. He says godliness is, in fact, highly beneficial, but only when accompanied by contentment. And if you look at the 5 verses objectively, verses 6 to 10, you see that, in fact, the main subject of the discussion is this idea of contentment. What Paul is telling us is that contentment is the necessary accompaniment to godliness. He's been telling us about godliness all along. Now he says this godliness I've been talking to you about needs to be accompanied by contentment, or it's not a means of great gain. The benefit is much limited if you're not content in your pursuit of godliness. So we find a few conclusions coming out of our text and related texts, and I'd like to pass them on to you tonight and consider them one by one. There will be three main conclusions coming from this text about contentment. And the first is that it is the exact opposite of the love of money. This attitude that we're called to, this attitude of contentment, is diametrically opposed to this other attitude described as the love of money. And what we need to do then, before we go further, is to identify what the love of money is all about. So let's talk about that for a minute. The love of money is such a basic aspect of our personalities, whether we succumb to it or not, we all know about it, that it's hard for us to understand exactly what it is that causes us to love money so much. We need to spend some time thinking about it to determine why it is that the world in general, and some Christians in particular, are obsessed with the love of money, especially considering the outcome of the love of money, as Paul highlights it here in this text. So let's think about this for a minute. What is it that causes people to love money? Of course, it's not the jingle of metal in your pockets. It's not just that charming sound, jingle, 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 as you walk down the way, or perhaps more realistically, the bulge in your hip pocket when you know your money, or when your pocket wallet is full of 20s and 50s. It's not that in itself. Neither is it a fascination for rumpled portraits of Her Majesty the Queen. There's something about money that draws us towards it, but it's none of those things. Or if it is that bulge in your hip pocket, it's only because of what that bulge represents to you. It's not because of the bulge. It's not because of the jingle itself. So what is it about money that is so intriguing that some men would devote literally their entire lives to the pursuit and the acquisition of it? Well, if we start at the very beginning and think this thing through clearly, we can explain the love of money this way. Starting with the statement that man was made for God. Think about it for a minute. Of course, it's true biblically. Man was made for God. So apart from God, we are quite incomplete. You just can't be fully there. You can't be everything God called you to be if God is not a part of your life, because we were made specifically for God. Now think about that. When man was created originally, he was quite a different thing than he is now. I mean, what we are is just a frail reflection of what we were created to be. That's an important point to grasp. Man now is fallen, and fallen, our need for God is all the more increased. We need God if we were perfect human beings as Adam was. Adam was not complete without God. But now that we are much less than Adam was, now that we're fallen into sin, our need of God is all the more increased. We need God just to get back to where we were supposed to be in the first place, and then when we get back to where we were supposed to be in the first place in the Garden of Eden, then like Adam, we need God just as he did. So being fallen, as we are, fallen into depravity, our need is increased. Well, there's a whole new element built into our need because we are fallen human beings, and that is that we resent our need. Not only do we need God more than ever because we are sinful by nature and by birth, but we resent needing him. And a verse that speaks of that is in Colossians. Colossians chapter 1, verse 21. Paul says, although you were formerly alienated and hostile in mind and engaged in evil deeds. This is the state of mind that man is found in before God begins to deal internally with a person. We are alienated from God, very much in need of God. We're far away from him, but we're alienated and we're hostile towards him. Not only do we need him, naturally, but we resent needing him. We're hostile and alienated. We are enemies of God, another verse says. So where do we go from that? Well, because we resent our need for God, we find ourselves striving for independence. And now there is a basic natural instinct in all mankind to not only divorce himself entirely from God, but somehow to strike up a state of life independent from God. And we find that as a basic human instinct now, not natural to us by creation, but natural by our fall into sin. So this is kind of the state of man as we see him all around. We were made for God. We need him more than ever, but we resent needing him, and so we long to be independent of God and to somehow stand on our own apart from God. Well, that's the case and has been the case ever since the beginning. And if you look at how man got into trouble in the first place, you see it was the attractiveness of independence that first caused man to sin, or in this case, woman. If you think of the Garden of Eden story in Genesis chapter 3, the lie that the serpent used to attract the woman to sin was that God knows in the day you eat from the tree that your eyes will be opened and you'll be like him, knowing good and evil. The tree that man and woman were forbidden to eat from was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the attractiveness about it was that if they ate it, they would be wise like God. And they would on their own be able to discern good from evil. Without eating it and without having an experiential knowledge of good and evil, they had to take God's word for it. They had to believe God when he said, this is good, this is evil. But the tree offered to give them, by its name, the knowledge of what was good and what was evil. It was attractive to make them wise, it says in verse 6. The serpent said, God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you'll be just like God. And there was a basic desire for independence even there before mankind fell into sin. Well, mankind, loving the idea of independence, fell into sin. And ever since, as sinful creatures, has been obsessed with the idea of standing apart from God and not needing God. Now, in this day and age, what is it that you need in order to be independent? In order to set your own scene, set your own direction in life, go in the way that you want to go, and not in any other direction? Well, the thing you need to control your own life, to pull your own strings, is money. And at the very back of the love of money, I think you'll always find this striving for an independent kind of life. If we don't have money, we're dependent upon other people. If we have money, we're independent, and most importantly, not only independent from our peers, our parents, our friends, but we can be independent, it seems, from God himself. And so we find within ourselves this desire to control our living by accumulating things, and of course money is the way to accumulate. This is a matter of basic human instinct now. One of the first concepts a baby learns is the concept of coveting. And so if you give a child something, one of the first words he catches on to is the word mine. I remember a friend of Debbie's and mine, who had twins, a boy and a girl, and he watched them for a good long while one afternoon when they were just about 10 months or a year old. They had both crawling up the opposite sides of a hassock. And in the middle of the hassock was a great big button that the upholsterer had put there. And the one little kid, I mean they're twins, they're identical age, grabbed on a thing and said, mine. And the other kid tore his hand away and said, mine. And they spent the whole afternoon doing this, coveting that thing. So they saw in that little button on the hassock some ability to find happiness, and they both coveted it. It's a basic human instinct. You don't have to teach a baby to own things. That comes with the territory. We're all born clutching and grabbing and controlling our destiny. And the sophisticated form of that is loving to pile up money by which we might control our destiny, control our quality of life, and live the way we want. Well, it was a lie in the Garden of Eden. It was not that God knew that eating from the tree of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve would become like God. That was a lie from the devil. It continues to be a lie, and mankind continues to fall into it. It's a lie. It's just not true that what we own affects the quality of our lives. Now, that's a clear statement of Christ's, and I should say it again. It's a lie, and it's not true that what we own affects the quality of our lives. The quality of our lives does not depend upon what we own, although it appears to. Jesus could not have said it any more clearly than in Luke chapter 12. This is an easy verse to read, but a difficult one to grasp practically. It's not difficult to grasp it academically, but it's very difficult to get it through our thick skulls and begin to live as if it were true. Jesus said in Luke 12:15, beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. They're telling us that greed comes in all sorts of forms, and we are to beware of every form of it. And here's the rationale. Here's why we should be aware and wary of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. Your life is not a matter of what you own, even if you own a whole lot. Whether a man is dirt broke or filthy rich, he's dirty either way, a man's life does not consist of what he owns. It doesn't affect the quality of his life. That takes a lot of grasping, because we don't believe it, because we believe the lie. We believe that a little more or a lot more material wealth will dramatically affect the quality of our lives for the better. But there's no guaranteed positive effect. And that's not just a New Testament truth, it's an Old Testament truth as well. The book of Ecclesiastes, written by a man who in every sense was filthy rich, says the same things. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 10. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. It's all futility, it's all vanity, it's all uselessness. Did you get that? a very rich man speaking and saying, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money. Money has no ability to deliver the things it offers. It offers them in a very convincing way, but it can't deliver. Because the idea that money can positively affect your life is a lie. And not only is it a lie, but it's a trap. And that's what Paul explains it to be in our text tonight. Not only is it a lie that money offers happiness or contentment or a better way of life, but it's a trap as well. And so we find him in verse 9 of 1 Timothy 6, saying that those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare. There it is, it's a trap. And they fall into many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. In verse 10 he says that the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, for money, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves, literally impaled themselves with many a pang. The soldiers in Vietnam knew all about the kind of booby traps that this is referring to. Snares to cripple you up, stakes in pits that you would fall down into and upon. These are pictures of what the love of money is all like. It's a lie, and it's a trap. It's a very attractive trap. And so Paul says in verse 10, some have already pierced themselves with many a pang. It's an effective trap, and it works very well. So the conclusion we can come to as we discuss the love of money is that the love of money is the exact opposite of godliness. Now, we bear in mind the definition of godliness we've been using all along. Godliness is devotion to God. It's that focus that keeps the eyes, the spiritual eyes, fixed on Jesus. Godliness is living a life devoted to God. And the love of money is exactly the opposite. For the love of money is motivated by eyes fixed solidly on ourselves and a desire to keep our eyes fixed on ourselves and to remain in a state of independence from God. And we find ourselves thinking that way because we have been lied to and we've believed it. We have been trapped in the snare called the love of money. Well, our starting point for that one was that contentment is the exact opposite of the love of money. And the second point, then, is that contentment is the exact complement of godliness. It's not the same thing as godliness. We can see that from our text. He calls us to godliness with contentment. They're not exactly the same thing, but they exactly complement each other. If you're taking notes, and don't scribble fast, I'll give you just a second to jot that down, and then I'll try to illustrate the point that contentment is a complement to godliness. It's the exact complement that fits it like a hand fits a glove. Contentment is the exact complement of godliness because it's the exact opposite of the love of money. Let me show you what I mean by this. Using a useful and amazing illustration. Here is the love of money, and here is contentment. Can you see which is which? All right? Well, there's a tension between them. They're opposite to each other. A person who succumbs to the love of money knows nothing about contentment. That's what it says in Ecclesiastes. He who loves money will not be satisfied by money, and he who is content will not love money. The two are mutually exclusive. Now, what we've seen as well is that the love of money is the exact opposite of godliness. Godliness is devotion to God, and the love of money is devotion to self. And these two are exactly opposite. So what you've got by necessity then is godliness, devotion to God, and contentment having something to do with each other. In fact, they go together, and they fit together and embellish one another. So that Paul says godliness is a means of great gain if it's accompanied with contentment. You need the two things. Godliness is a good thing to have regardless, but if you're godly and yet discontent, you're missing out on great gain. And we'll see in a minute that if you're content but not godly, well, that doesn't do much good at all. The two of them go together. We want to look at the meaning of contentment for a minute, and a good reference is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 8, where the same word is used by Paul with an entirely different English definition, because, in fact, the word can be translated more literally than contentment. You find it in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 8. That's a chapter on liberality or generous giving to Christian causes. It's a verse that's often used in churches for a number of reasons, and it has the word contentment in here translated in a different way. In the New American Standard, translated as two different words. Paul says, God is able to make all grace abound to you, that always, having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. And the two words that we find here, all sufficiency, are in fact a translation of the one word, contentment. The very same word translated contentment in 1 Timothy. All sufficiency in the sense of being able to say, what I have is entirely sufficient. And that's the definition of contentment as Paul uses it. Very same word translated here, all sufficiency. And that's a more literal translation. Contentment is saying, what I've got here is enough. Now here's why contentment and godliness are not exactly the same thing. Contentment versus godliness, we'll look at them in contrast. Contentment is a reference toward things. Contentment is looking out on the things in your life and then finding yourself saying in reference to the things in your life, it's enough. I don't need anything more than what I've got. All of this and no more is quite sufficient. Contentment then is an attitude towards things which responds to things by saying, what I've got is enough. Godliness, on the other hand, we know, is an attitude towards God, remember? We've been looking at that all along. It's a devotedness or a focus on God. And it's quite inappropriate in our attitude towards God to speak of all sufficiency. It would be wrong for us to say, yes, I have the Lord, and I have enough of Him. I don't want any more. I'm content. We're not to be content with the amount of God that we have, the amount of knowledge of God and the understanding of the power of God. Our attitude towards God should be one of discontentment, if we can speak like that, in the sense of always wanting more, hungering and longing for Him. You think of the Psalms that talk about the deer panting after the water streams and our hearts panting after God. But these two complement each other, right? Because if I'm the sort of person who craves for more of God, who longs for more of God, then I don't long for more things. I wouldn't have any place to put them. I wouldn't have any time for them. I'm glad to have as few things as I have so that I can get on with the pursuit of God. And in the same way, if I'm caught up with the desire for more things, if the things in my life are not enough, then I'm saying that God is. I don't need any more of God. What I need is more things. This explains why in Colossians, Paul talks about greed the way he does. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, no need to turn to it, but keep it there for future reference. He says that greed, which would be the same thing as discontentment, is greed amounts to idolatry. Find yourself a person embroiled in greed, and you found yourself an idol worshiper. Whatever it is he's greedy for has become his God. Greed amounts to idolatry. Think about that again. Greed is the opposite of contentment. Contentment is the complement of godliness. You see how all this is working. Greed amounts to idolatry. When we worship God, we say that He is worthy of our life's attention, of our whole heart. And we sing to Him in worship, He's all I need. He's all I need. Jesus is all I need. And that's godliness. That's focusing on God. The greedy man can't sing that. He has a different song. Let me show you. There's more I need. There's more I need. Still, there's more I need. Isn't this embarrassing? Bigger home, bigger car, and a trip somewhere far. And still, there's more I need. And on it goes. Focus your attention. Applaud if you like. Focus your attention on one thing, and it satisfies until you've got it. And then you need the same thing but bigger, or the same size but different. And on it goes, and it never ends. That's idolatry. That's saying that the sum and substance of your life is something. Paul says greed amounts to idolatry. If you'd like a recording of just that segment of the sermon, you can speak to the tape people. If you'd like that segment cut out of the tape, you can talk to the tape man as well. All right, there's one other conclusion about contentment that comes from our text tonight, and that is that contentment is a learned response. It's a learned response. It does not come natural. It does not come naturally. It's a learned response. And our obligation as Christians pursuing godliness is to learn to respond that way. Let's think about these two words, the fact that it's a response and then the fact that it's learned, and I'll show you where I got them. It's a response. Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6 speaks of it as a response. Let's look there together. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5 and 6. The writer to the Hebrews says, "Let your character be free from the love of money, being content with what you have. For He Himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you, so that we confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What shall man do to me?" It's not natural for us to be content with what we have. Because from infancy, we've had this desire to clutch onto the button on the hassock and keep it for ourselves. We've grown up with that. It's not a natural thing to be content in this sense used here. And so it's a response, and a response particularly to the promises of God. The writer to the Hebrews is saying, you're going to have to lay this upon yourself. You're going to have to catch on to this. You can do it if you choose to. You can let your character be free from the love of money. You can be content with what you have, but you've got to let it happen. You've got to choose to make your character free from the love of money. And to motivate us towards that state of freedom from the love of money, he reminds us of an Old Testament promise. It comes from Deuteronomy. I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. And the person who just parrots that limply knows nothing about contentment from it. But when we really begin to grasp the fact that God will not desert us and will not forsake us, that we've got as much of God as we want for as long as we want Him in our lives, well then our response to those promises of God's ever-abiding presence will be a sort of contentment, an ever-increasing degree of contentment in regard to things. He then reminds of another Old Testament statement from the Psalms again. The Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What shall man do to me? If that's just a wall plaque in your house, it does nothing for you. But if that promise, that statement of the Word becomes a real motto of your life and a matter of your thinking, if you grasp the fact that the Lord really is your helper, and because He's your helper, you do not need to be afraid, because no man will be able to do anything to you apart from the will of God, well, that produces, or we can respond to that with an attitude of contentment. We're talking about Christian contentment here. There are other forms of contentment which don't count. And the sort of contentment that Paul is talking about is the sort of contentment that is a product or a complement to godliness. It comes as a response to the Word of God. There are some people who are perfectly content, but it's just because they were born inheriting a fortune and they've never needed to work a day in their lives. There are some people who are content simply because they're unambitious. They just don't care. They're lazy or lethargic or complacent or just not very intelligent. They're happy with what they got just because they can't imagine having anything that they don't have already. And that's not the same thing. Those are surface kinds of contentment. They don't last. They're entirely circumstantial. And the circumstances only need to change before that kind of contentment evaporates. But the kind of contentment that Paul is holding out, and the writer of the Hebrews is holding out here, is a sort of contentment that comes as a response to God's Word. It's Christian contentment. It's the contentment that comes from knowing that Christ is your rock and strength, and you don't need any rock bigger and more strong than that. It's a contentment that comes from saying with meaning, God is enough. I recognize that He is enough. I've got Him, and all of Him I want, and I can have more of Him as I pursue my walk with Him, and that should be fine with me. And that is entirely uncircumstantial. That is entirely apart from any kind of circumstances. We saw that as we closed off our study of 2 Thessalonians. Remember that? Does this verse sound familiar? Now may the Lord of peace Himself continually grant you peace in every circumstance. The Lord be with you all. Those 2 points go together. May the Lord of peace Himself continually grant you peace in every circumstance. The Lord be with you all. You see, if I've got a good sense of God being with me, then I can be at peace in every circumstance. Because wherever I am and whatever's happening, I've got God there with me. That's what the writer to the Hebrews is saying. The Lord is my helper. What shall man do to me? And if you want a biblical example of that sort of contentment, the contentment that comes as a response to God being present in the life, well, you don't need to look very far. Because almost every good guy, I could say every good guy in the Old Testament, has mastered to some degree this principle. You think of David. You say, well, it's easy for him to be content. He was a king. But as far as being a king went, he had about 6 happy days in his whole life. And all the rest of the life was clutching and scraping towards the throne or fighting the enemies off after he got to the throne. You read through the Psalms and see that, he had lots of problems, lots of enemies. But when he was focused on God, we saw this last summer in our study of David, when he was focused on God, he was at peace in all his circumstances. And think of Joseph and Daniel and Abraham and Job, Jeremiah and Habakkuk, and a number of other men in the Old Testament. They all mastered this concept. And there are some women as well, for those of you who are wondering. They learned that God was in their lives. They concluded that God was enough. And in response to the enoughness of God, the sufficiency of God, they became very content with their lot in life. Though their lot in life seemed to leave a lot to be desired. Almost every Old Testament hero, look through the book of the chapter 11 of Hebrews, almost every Old Testament hero is a perfect illustration of that point. If you find God to be enough, in your life, then you certainly have enough of other things. Your focus drops from them very quickly. We're looking at the fact that it's a learned response, and we need a New Testament example anyway. So let's look at Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 to 13. There we find Paul as our New Testament example of contentment, and we see him speaking about learning the principle of contentment. It didn't come natural even to the Apostle Paul. It was to him not a natural response, but a response he learned. Philippians 4, verses 11 to 13. Now, interestingly enough, this is going to end on a verse that just about everyone knows. It's a real wall plaque verse. But here we have a chance to set it in its context and see the sort of things Paul was talking about when he made this colossal and wonderful statement. Philippians 4:11. Paul has just encouraged the Philippians to get on with the good work of donating to the church financially. And he makes sure they understand where he's coming from in verse 11. He says, "Not that I speak from want, for I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am." You see that? He's not naturally content in whatever circumstances he's in, but he's learned to be content in whatever circumstances he's in. He says, "I encourage you to give money to the Christian church. I'll take it and distribute it as it should be distributed. But don't get me wrong, I'm not speaking from want, because I've learned a thing or two. I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means. So I can get by with nothing. I can get along with humble means. And I also know how to live in prosperity." Interesting that he tells us that's something you've got to learn as well. You've got to learn how to be content in prosperity as much as you've got to learn how to get along with humble means. But because he learned to be content, see, now he knows how to get along in humble means and in prosperity. He says, "In any and in every circumstance, I've learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, the secret both of having abundance and suffering need." His conclusion, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Now there's that famous verse, and it applies in 100 different areas of life, but the life issue that Paul is talking about is the issue of learning to be content. And he says, "Christ will strengthen me so I can continue to practice contentment in every circumstance." I've learned how to do it. I've learned how to look to Christ for strength and to be content. So you're not out of the woods if you say, "Well, sorry, some people are good at some things and other people are good at other things. As for me, I'm not good at contentment." Of course you're not good at it. You're a child of Adam and Eve, and none of their children were ever good at it naturally. But you can learn to be good at it if you look to Christ, for he will strengthen you to be content in whatever circumstances you're in. There's an aspect of learning it in our text as well. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 8. There's a kind of dictatorial meaning to that verse. Paul is handing out orders. Picture it in a German accent and you get the point. "And if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content." That's the kind of way he means it. We shall be content. We insist on being content. We've decided we're going to be content. All right? No offense to all you folks from the northern part of Europe. I just meant that it kind of captures the spirit of the thing there. He's handing out an order. We shall be content. We've made up our minds. We're not going to continue to be discontent. That's an insult to God. We'll take what we need, we'll take food, and we'll take covering, and then we determine, we make up our minds, we're going to be content with that. We will not grieve the Spirit of God by being discontent any further. So it's something you have to learn. And if you're like me, then you need to know how to learn it. Because, again, it doesn't come naturally. Even if we're sort of complacent and lethargic by temperament, there's so many things in the world that stir up our lusts and our desires and our materialistic tendencies that we all need to learn how to be content. So let me give you as the key to learning contentment a concept that comes from Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. We've looked at these verses before because they sum up the idea of godliness, but because godliness and contentment are complements, they go together hand in hand. These verses also epitomize contentment. They epitomize godliness and contentment. Colossians 3, verses 1 and 2. Paul says, "If then you have been raised up with Christ," if you belong up there with Christ, if you're alive in Christ, then keep seeking the things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on earth. The secret to learning contentment, it's no secret at all. The key to learning contentment is focusing the heart on God. And we've got to do that by an act of the will. We set our mind on the things above. We do not set our mind on the things that are on earth. To be more specific, let's look at that negatively and positively. And the negative thing you must do, although it will take some real positive action, the negative thing you must do is to remove all the distractions. If I'm going to focus my attention on God, I've got to remove from my life the distractions that will keep me from focusing my thoughts on God. So I've got to take an assessment of myself and think, what is it that keeps me from meditating on God day and night? When I sit down and say, okay, Wilk, meditate for a while here, and I start trying to think about God, what is it that leads my thoughts astray? Well, I can try it tonight and analyze and see what is it that pulls my thoughts away. And I'll see things that I've got to stop doing to remove the distractions from my life. One suggestion I would have, practically speaking, is to give up the filthy habit of window shopping. No offense to people who are really into that. But what is window shopping but covetousness? Going out and drooling over the things you know you just can't afford right now. Those window shops are not set up by professional window dressers with the idea of instilling contentment in potential customers, right? Those things are dolled up to get you into the store. The people who run the stores can't afford you to walk by and not buy. They've got to do everything they can. They hire professional window shoppers specifically to make the windows enticing so that you just can't walk by without being stirred within with a desire to own what you see displayed there. In the same way, some of us need to give up browsing through certain magazines. I don't mean to make any particular jab at any particular magazine, but magazines, for example, that display better homes and gardens can be a real source of discontentment to certain people. Don't let me get any more specific than that. But if you're living in a home that you're not content with, and you find it an enjoyable thing to browse through magazines that show you homes you'll never be able to afford, or would only be able to afford at great sacrifice of more important things, whatever those would be, well, that's a bad idea. I mean, some people can window shop with no problem. They continue to meditate upon God day and night as they look over millions of dollars worth of retail merchandise. Some people can browse through better homes and gardens. They praise the Lord. Isn't it great that some people get to live in these suckers? But not all of us can do that, and everyone should know his own heart. In the same way, I would say that some of us need to remove the distractions caused by television. Television, you got to understand, is an industrial investment. Corporations, big corporations, spend millions and millions of dollars every year on television advertising, specifically because they know it's such a good way to stir up greed within the general populace. You're you're betting your money against the guys at Madison Avenue every time you turn the TV on. It's a commercial tool. The people who put those shows on are not just putting it on because they hope you're not bored tonight. They're putting it on because they know by enticing you to watch the show through the promised entertainment, they get 60 seconds every few minutes to throw at you their best shot at advertising, with the hope that you'll no longer be content to be without the particular product that they're flogging. The people who make television cannot afford you to be content. They are entirely opposed to your contentment. And some people just cannot stand the pressure. Now, some of you can. And I'm not trying to make a general comment about television tonight. I'm just trying to make a specific comment in terms of focusing the heart on God and learning the art of contentment. Still, it stands to be said that for some people, a major step towards godliness would be to drop-kick their televisions through their living room windows, get rid of the silly things, and spend their time meditating on God's Word and learning to drool over the promises of God realized in your life, rather than to drool over the things that the people in Hollywood and down on Madison Avenue in New York City want us to drool over. And that's just the way it works, right? I mean, the people who are behind these multi-million-dollar advertising campaigns know that most of us will not be able to resist it once we find out that it only costs $1.28 and it slices, dices, and even makes julienne fries. You hear that, you got to have it. And they all make their money. So if we're cultivating contentment rather than greed, these things are possible distractions that we need to remove from our lives. Positively, a step we can take towards focusing our heart upon God is to meditate upon His Word so that we can see God more clearly. We must see more of God. We must see Him more clearly if we wish to bring our minds into the state where we long for Him more. Most of us are as unenthused about God as we are because we know so little about Him. But if we only had a better idea of what He could do for us, we'd long for Him all the more. By removing the distractions so that we've got less to compete in our minds with God, and by meditating on God's Word so that we can see Him more clearly, God will move us bit by bit towards that place of focusing our heart on God. And somewhere along the line, He'll speak to us the words that He spoke to potential disciples in Luke chapter 14. In Luke chapter 14, it says that great multitudes went with the Lord. Excuse me. At the height of His popularity, everyone wanted to be His follower. And in verse 25, He actually stopped and turned to the crowd and discouraged them from following Him. And He discouraged them because they were following Him under false pretenses. They had no idea what He was demanding of them. And all that He was demanding of them came down to the statement that He closed with in verse 33. We'll sort of close with. He said more after, but this is really the summary statement. He says, no one of you can be my disciple unless he forsakes all that he has. Unless you're willing to give up on all of your earthly dreams, you can't be my disciple and pursue the heavenly dreams that I lay out before you. That's a very strong statement. That's one of the hyperbolic statements of the Lord, where he puts things in the strongest possible terms so you don't miss the point. But some of us need to apply the point entirely and thoroughly to some particular aspects of our lives. For some of us, there's one particular thing about which Jesus says, you can't be my disciple unless you forsake it, unless you give it away, or give it up, or at least put it on the block and see if someone will buy it. I mean, there's specific things in mind that God would have for each of us if we pursued them along these lines. Specific things that he's asking us to give up because they serve permanently as distractions in our minds and our hearts. And if we are to set our minds on the things above and not on the things below, we've got to get rid of that thing below so that we're free to serve him. Next week, as we continue and conclude our study of 1 Timothy, we'll see that there is a place for rich Christian people. And there's specific instructions towards the end of chapter 6 on how to be rich and not suffer for it. That's the way to say it. Riches can be a great detriment to the Christian life, but don't need to be. And there's a place for rich Christians. But if your heart leaps up at that very thought, then you know it's not a well of contentment that's motivating that thought. There is a place for Christian rich people, but it's a dangerous and tricky path to tread. Next week, Paul tells us how we can get on with treading it. So if you're rich, come back next week and we'll see from God's Word what you ought to do with all that stuff hanging around in your bank account. But in the meantime, God calls us to higher and better things. He calls us to pursue him, himself, to pursue contentment towards things at the same time. Let's pray.